CNBC TV 18, celebrating 15 years of leadership.
Welcome back to Indianomics. We've been speaking with two eminent men who have been connected with banking. Mr. M. Damodaran, a former chairman of SEBI and of IDBI, and of course a person who has done a lot of work in improving Indian banks, and Mr. A.K. Purwar, former chairman of State Bank of India. We are discussing whether the separation of the CMD post into MD and chairman and the selection of eminent men as chairman is a good first step. Mr. Damodaran, the more important selection, as we have been talking, would be of the MDs. At the moment, in the second round of advertisements, the eligibility criteria has been expanded to 45 to 57 years, 15 years experience in the banking industry itself, and 1 year board level experience. Do you think that this start to make the selection itself competitive and not just a normal ED being promoted as MD is a good start? Will we get at least competitive, competent people with this process?
Let me respond to your first question, which you asked some time ago, which is, would generalist IAS officers make good chairmen?
Yes.
Let's remember that one of the much lauded governors, and lauded for good reasons, governors of the RBI in recent times was a former IAS officer called Dr. Y.V. Reddy. Therefore, let us not, because of some prejudice, believe that persons who come from a certain background are necessarily underqualified for any important job. That said, to get to your question on the selection process for managing directors, let's try and understand what the problem is with the public sector banks. The first problem is they suffer from a lack of a level playing field. Because they suffer from a lack of a level playing field, and because of the additional restrictions imposed on the leadership, they are not able to manifest whatever leadership qualities reside in them to an adequate extent. I do not believe that given the size of public sector banks, you cannot find enough leaders to manage these banks, and that you have to look outside to the private sector. It is not as if the private sector is the repository of all efficiency, because efficiency is ownership neutral, and you have seen a number of private sector banks and other private sector institutions come to grief. Is governance very high in private sector banks?
No.
I can give you any number of examples. It will keep us here till tomorrow, including people that walked out on their boards because they were unhappy with the recommendations of the Nomination and Remuneration Committee. So let's not go there. What we need to invest time and money in, and we've not done that, is to have a proper selection process which identifies good potential in public sector banks and brings them up to leadership positions sooner rather than later. If you look at the way people have been selected over the last few years, with interviews for executive directors on occasion taking 2 or 3 minutes, with half the selection committee absent when some people were interviewed, reportedly with lists prepared in advance of the meetings. Now, that's not the way to select leaders, and then you believe that the public sector cannot throw up leaders. I don't buy into that. I'm hoping that this selection will throw up some good names, but I do not imagine a private sector banker who is seeing a career progression in his or her bank will willingly migrate to a public sector bank. So are we looking at less than the best moving from the private sector to the public sector? These are the things that worry me.
Yeah, that would be disaster indeed if less than the best went to the public sector. Mr. Damodaran, I completely take your point that the government as shareholder and as in a sense regulator should change its DNA in terms of approaching commercial banks. But to come to you, Mr. Purwar, while those seminal changes have to happen at some point in time, is this at least going to be a better tomorrow for the public sector banks after this process of MDs is over?
You see, I would put it this way, any change is always attempted for the better, and I'm sure, and it has to evolve. So I would put it this way, that let us give time to this to happen. But I would fully support what Mr. Damodaran said. Public sector has its own rich quality, very good quality people. And some of the institutions in public sector, including my former bank, we have hugely talented people who can manage all kinds of banks. So, and they can stand into comparison with the best in the private sector. So I don't buy this. I would put it this way, that we have to have a very strong selection process to ensure that top quality people get selected for these jobs.
Okay.
And there has to be a very strong, robust process, selection process to make this happen. There has to be, we are playing with public money, we're running into hundreds of lakhs of crores of rupees.
Okay.
And therefore people who are going to manage these have to be of topmost quality. Okay. There should be no compromise there.
No, I two very important takeaways from what you experts are telling me. One, that the selection process has to be robust, and two, that you believe the public sector has a lot of talent. And considering the people I'm speaking to, I clearly buy into that argument. I was just making the point that some critics have made. But Mr. Damodaran, now for the last question. We are in, the system has evolved over 70 years and it is not going to change very dramatically overnight. But if you have to give one piece of advice or some piece of advice to improve the system, what would that be?
I would say select better leaders, identify better leaders, select better leaders, mentor them, and these eminent people that you mentioned at the beginning of the program can come in there, create a level playing field for public sector banks, empower the leadership, and let the leadership see itself as empowered, because it's not enough to empower. The perception of empowerment is also important. And let young people look at this as a career option where if you join at a very young age, you can progress to the top job in the organization. What you are now signaling to the youth who will apply for these jobs tomorrow is no matter how good you are, you will not become the chairman of the bank, because that is somebody who will come from the outside based on a track record outside of banking, or mostly outside of banking. Is that the signal you want to give to young people joining a large public sector industry?
No, I take your point, sir. In fact, now when Mrs. Bhattacharya of SBI tried to recruit from the campuses, the court struck it down, saying that it has to be done through a national recruitment exam and process. So, Mr. Purwar, do you think an immediate step actually should be to try and bring it down to 49%? I know the government has a huge problem trying to get any legislation through, but a whole lot of these controls are happening because of the 51% plus that the government has. So is it that instead of pushing the legislative change to the back burner, we may perhaps have to advance that, and otherwise these are going to be cosmetic?
Latha, ultimately that has to happen. It may not happen today, but ultimately tomorrow. But it has to happen tomorrow. But having said that, the question is not of 49% or 51% ownership. Question is of proper selection of leaders. And I still remember when I joined the bank, State Bank of India, in the initial program, one very senior officer came and told that one of us is going to be the chairman of the bank one day. And that is the dream with which all of us started the institution and worked hard for it. The point is that we have to have assurance give assurance to the people, youngsters, that you have as good a chance of becoming a chairman if you are meritorious, we perform well. And as far as quality of people is concerned, there is no dearth. Having said that, if you ask them what would be one comment of mine for tomorrow, I would say, look at the people who can create the organizations to the next level, who can give world-class banking to the people of the country. So, here I personally feel a lot of work is to be done.
Oh, actually, the consistency of the government's approach, for the moment we are seeing a lot of professionalism, but this is, a one-time wonder. We don't see it consistently from the government at all. Mr. Damodaran, what is your sense? Do you think that only if this 51% plus ownership is removed, there's restriction of leadership. You started by saying restrictions on the leadership. That comes because of, partly because of the CVC, CAG requirements, also because, as Mrs. Bhattacharya was told, that you have to go through national recruitment boards. Your salaries also have to have a certain scale. There are restrictions all over the place. So do you think that reducing that 51% majority is not a last good step, but maybe the first mandatory step?
That is neither immediately necessary nor is it immediately practicable. It's not going to be easy, as Mr. Purwar said, to get to 51, to get below.
But can
50.
Restrictions be removed without it?
There will be problems there. Well, restrictions means what? If you are generating pressure yourself, stop generating pressure. Ownership need not translate to pressure on management. That's the first step. Number two, you have safety valves even within the existing systems to ensure, or you must have, to ensure that bona fide errors of judgment are not punished. Because that is the sword which hangs over most of the public sector bank people. But going back to your question about campus recruitment and the inability to do that because you have more than 50% government ownership, well, all the eminent leaders that the banks have provided, including my fellow panelists, have not been recruited on the campuses to the best of my knowledge. They were recruited through in-house recruitment processes that were rigorous, multi-stage, and aimed at getting the best people into an organization that prided itself on being the best. So why can't we approach it that way? Why do we see the absence of campus recruitment as the major hurdle? And let's assume that you go to the campus and get some extremely bright women and men. What is the guarantee that you'll hold on to them, given that the outside world is going to pay much better even if you increase your salaries reasonably significantly?
Okay.
So I think what we are doing is we have a set of excellent solutions. We have a set of deep-seated problems. Are these the solutions for the problems that exist? I'm not so sure.
Okay.
I think let's not tinker with the system. Let us look at strengthening the system. After all, it is a system that, for all its problems, has delivered something. It has taken banking to the common man. It has given simple products to the common people. Even recently, who was in the forefront of the Jan Dhan movement? It was the public sector banks. Who is now pushing actually the insurance schemes for the poor? It's the public sector banks. They are the instrumentalities. So you need them to do all of that. And then you say there is no leadership, they can't deliver, so I must go outside and get people. I think it's unfair, to say the least.
Fair point, sir. Actually, we are out of time, but I think we're not out of ideas or advice from my panel. The important point is public sector has delivered on many accounts, and therefore the process and the intent of the government to make the selection process robust should be institutionalized. It can't be a one-time wonder, and therefore we have to wait to see how the government institutionalizes this and empowers the chairmen who have already been shortlisted and the MDs and CEOs who are going to be selected. Even that will be a very big effort. We hope that this is the first step to that process. Mr. Damodaran, Mr. Purwar, thank you very much for joining me and removing some of the bad ideas that are bedeviling the system. That's it on Indianomics. Thanks for watching.
CNBC TV 18, celebrating 15 years of leadership.